Unreal. Is there a share link? Oh.
Hi. Hi.
Okay, no, I'm in it, crew. This is my. Oh, let's take some pics of us.
I'm actually, we're live streaming right now, so we just need to.
Oh, are we? I think. Hi, Con.
Hey,
I'll check that link. Yeah, I need to go get my phone. Alas, a minute.
Very good.
You're gonna run. We lost everyone else.
Just off air.
Wait, did you post it?
I'm so excited. Yeah, no, it's going on. It's fine. It's sure?
here, yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And that's the link for it as well.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much. And so on behalf of DU players as well as the film, we'd like to welcome you tonight on the last evening of the 1916 Festival, which has been a great success so far. We're very proud of ourselves. And we hope that you guys came to some of our events and enjoyed them. And we still have this debate as well as a night out afterwards where we'll have Derek Warfield and Connor Scully on the decks at the Kells Pub. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce our speakers, first of all, who are going to join us tonight. So on proposition, we have Felix Larkin, historian and retired public servant, Patty McGarry, Irish Times journalist, Dee Courtney, student of history and politics, and Liam Kennedy, professor at Queen's University, Belfast. Then on the opposition bench, we have Diarmuid O'Houlihan, student speaker, Liz Gillis, author and curatorial assistant in RTE, Liam Kelly, student speaker, and Christopher Costigan, student speaker also. we're no heroes, I'd like to call on our registrar, Dr. Keane Henry, to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
For my second set of minutes, and for the week that's in it, I'm going to eschew my usual comedic routine and instead read directly from the records from this time, from 1915, just before the Easter Rising. Okay. A general meeting of the University Philosophical Society was held in the debating hall of the THB, Trinity College, Dublin, on Thursday evening, November 3rd, 1915. The chair was taken by Dr. J.P. Mahaffey, Vice Provost of the University. The On-Secretary, Mr. O.G. Fisher, BA, read the minutes of the last meeting, and the chairman distributed the Society's medals. The President gave his commencement address, from which I will now quote. My Chairman, my Lord and Gentlemen, the new session commences under the shadow of war, and many of our members have left us to join the army. Those of us who remain, however, feel it our duty to carry on the work of the Society to the best of our ability. The Society has this year to mourn the loss of three of its most distinguished honorary members. The late Provost, who always took a deep interest in our Society, as in every other college activity, Sir Robert Ball and Sir Dr. R.Y. Tyrrell, two men of such eminence in science and literature, respectively, that any eulogy is needless. The Right Honourable Sir Horace Blunt proposed, and the Lord Mayor of Dublin, who's there for some reason, Mr. Lorcan Sherlock, seconded the motion that the thanks of the Society are due to the President for his address, and that it be printed at the expense of the Society. The motion was carried unanimously. The Chairman formally proposed, and Mr. HMO Whiteska seconded the motion that the thanks of the Society are due to the distinguished visitors who have honoured it with their presence this evening. The motion is carried unanimously. The Chair concluded with a quotation from Sir Samuel Ferguson, which shows the spirit in which all must come, men of both sides, to build up the new Ireland, in kindliness, in manliness, in justice, to make Éireann a nation yet, self-respecting, self-relying, self-advancing. Are these the qualities of Irish men, and these the ideals they will cherish for their country? It is on that their future will depend. There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
Is anyone at the last private business meeting and would like to object to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last public business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. So in terms of standing orders for tonight's debate, guest speakers will have speeches of 10 minutes in length, while student speakers will have speeches of 7 minutes in length. In both cases, the first and final minute are protected, which means that you cannot offer points of information. Points of information are welcome from the opposite side in the debate, as well as the audience as a whole. And this is simply a short interjection where you stand up and say, sir or madam, if there's something that you would like to interrupt with or say in response to what you've just heard. And if you're accepted, please offer kind of 10 seconds, 1 sentence. And if not, we ask you to sit back down. And if you're not feeling in the mood for points of information, but have strong feelings towards what is being said, we strongly encourage you to say here, here, if you like it, or shame if you don't. Then we'll be on the bell. So after 1 minute, when you can start giving points of information, you will hear the following sound. And then 6 minutes for student speakers and 9 minutes for guest speakers. When you can no longer offer points of information, you will hear a... You need to be consistent now, so it needs to be the same sound. And then when speeches are over, at 10 minutes for guest speakers and 7 minutes for student speakers, you'll hear a double ring, which sounds as such. Thank you very much, Ben. And I'd also like to point you towards the oratory returns, which are on all of your seats. This is to rate student speakers in the debate, and at the end of the year, we collate all of the results from all of the debates and give the gold medal of oratory to the best speech of the year, as well as awarding a top 10. So we definitely encourage you to fill them out thoughtfully, and not just high points for your best friends. Just kind of have a think about what you thought of all of the speeches. Would be really great and highly appreciated. So, without any further ado on arguing that the men of 1916 were no heroes, I would like to invite Felix Larkin, guest speaker, who is a historian and retired public servant. He is the former chairman of the newspaper and periodical History Forum of Ireland. So, Felix Larkin.
And I'm relieved to hear that you are not going to rate the guest speakers. The men and women of 1916 were certainly men and women of high ideals, but they were no heroes, for their actions were profoundly undemocratic and morally suspect. They had no popular mandate for what they did, and nobody can deny that. The distinguished historian F.X. Martin was writing in 1966 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, characterized the Rising as a conspiracy of a minority. He wrote that the Easter Rising was a coup d'etat against the British government. It ran flat counter to the wishes of Redmond and the majority of Irish nationalists. It was a mutiny against McNeill and the constitution of the Irish Volunteers, and it usurped the powers of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood.
Sir, why does an oppressed group need a mandate to stop their oppression?
Because, well, I will deal with this at a later stage as to whether we are dealing with oppression here at all and the quality of the oppression. But in any event, the question is, if you act, who are you accountable to? The case against the Rising on democratic grounds had been eloquently stated by Owen McNeill in a memorandum that he circulated to his fellow officers in the Irish Volunteers in February 1916, 2 months before the Rising. McNeill began by asserting that the only reason that could justify general active military measures would be reasonably calculated or estimated prospect of success in the military sense, and not merely some future moral or political advantage which may be hoped for as a result of non-success. He then wrote, and I quote, and this goes to the point that you raised, "Now we believe that we think rightly on national matters, and if possibly we do not agree on every point, we believe that the consensus we hold among us is right as far as it goes. It is our duty to so act that our country itself, the Irish nation, shall learn, so far as may be secured, to think in the same way. In other words, if we are right, it is our duty to get our country on our side and not to be content with the vanity of thinking ourselves to be right and other Irish people to be wrong." He concluded as follows: "I am definitely opposed to any proposal that may come forward involving insurrection. I have no doubt at all that my consent to any such proposal at this time and under these circumstances would make me false to my country, besides involving me in the guilt of murder." That is a clear statement of the reasons why Owen McNeill opposed the Rising and sought to stop it, and it explains the problems that the Rising presents for the Democrat and the theologian. This brings me to the moral argument. There are traditionally, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, 5 criteria which, taken together, would justify revolution. The first is just cause. In the context of 1916, the government would have to have been a tyranny without a legitimate title to rule Ireland. Second, violence must be the last resort. There should be no other option for getting rid of the tyranny. Third, there should be proportionality between the evil caused by the revolt and the evil that it seeks to replace. Fourth, there should be a reasonable prospect of success. And fifth, the action should have the approval of the community at large. It is frankly doubtful whether even one of these criteria was met when the men of 1916 marched out on Easter Monday. I accept, of course, that the UK Parliament had denied the will of the Irish people for some form of self-government. But the Irish people since O'Connell's time had chosen electorally to pursue their goal of self-government by constitutional means. The support for those who advocated other means, for example, Young Ireland in 1848 and the Fenians in 1866, had been derisory. The men of 1916 thus flouted the clear will of the Irish people as regards the means by which they wished to pursue the goal of self-government. And we must acknowledge that in 1916, Ireland sent its freely elected representatives to Westminster, to the Westminster Parliament, and they participated fully in its deliberations. Not exactly the oppressive, tyrannical regime that some apologists for the Rising would argue existed in Ireland in 1916.
Surely the mutiny by British officers when the Home Rule bills were about to be passed indicates that Britain was unwilling to leave Ireland.
It does not reflect on the will of the British Parliament that Ireland should be given self-government. It was a practical problem, I grant you that. As regards proportionality, let me say this. There were 3,000 civilian casualties in New York on 9/11. That represented 0.037% of the city's population in 2001. In 1916, the innocent civilian victims numbered in excess of 250, which represents a casualty rate of 0.07%, twice that of the 9/11 atrocity. When one factors in the casualties among the rebels, army and police, the dead of 1916 rises to above 0.16% of Dublin's population. That, I think, puts Easter Week 1916 into its proper perspective. Relatively speaking, in terms of the loss of life, more calamitous than 9/11. Accordingly, I regard 1916 as an example of what Jonathan Sacks, the former British chief rabbi, has called altruistic evil. It's evil in a sacred cause in the name of high ideals. Now, some will say that in the general election of December 1918, the Irish people gave its approval in retrospect to the Easter Rising. But I'm afraid history isn't as simple as that. The 1918 general election was won in Ireland by the Sinn Féin party, which had no hand, act or part in the 1916 Rising, and was, after 1917, a much broader coalition of advanced nationalists than the IRB cabal that had brought about the Rising. Moreover, the Sinn Féin triumph in December 1918 was boosted by the anti-conscription campaign earlier in 1918. So there was not a clear line of descent from 1916 to 1918. Nevertheless, the claim of retrospective endorsement of the Rising by the people of Ireland in 1918 is now the standard defence of the Rising against those who would query its democratic or moral credentials, or both. Apart altogether from its dubious validity from a historical point of view, as I've just explained, this argument brings us into dangerous political territory. The sophistry of thus attempting to justify the Rising leaves the way open to any crackpot movement to claim that its actions are justified by an imagined or hoped for retrospective vindication. That is precisely what successive generations of Republicans have argued in defense of their armed campaigns since 1922. Campaigns that have repeatedly threatened to undermine the democratic and truly Republican character of the independent Irish state. This legacy of political violence bequeathed to us by the men and women of 1916 is another reason why we should not, and I cannot, regard them as heroes. Thank you.
Chair. Really only one point. The idea of the first very turn-up. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what we consider a hero and what it is to slaughter sacred cows. Firstly, then, you spoke of oppression and kind of said that it was relatively minimal in Ireland, or just less so than other parts of the world. See the fact that in many Irish songs, such as Kilcosh, Conaghain Fleet Fostic on Island, our forests were decimated for the colonial interests of Britain. See, for example, our wildlife was eradicated for the colonial interests of an imperial Britain. See, for example, we were bludgeoned down successive times and also denied food, see Trevelyan's letters, by a British regime who had more interest in Britain than in the Irish people. I consider that oppression. I beg you to stand against that. Then, on to the talk about, the murder and the casualties of 1916. Yes, it is horrible. Yes, it is horrible that a young boy at the magazine fort in the Phoenix Park turned to the gun, no thank you, and was shot in the back by the rebels. Yes, that is horrible, but it is not as horrible that thousands of Irish boys and Irish girls died of starvation and poverty in the slums of Ireland from 1916 back as far as Britain had slums in Ireland, the worst slums in Europe, ladies and gentlemen. That is something to put into perspective. If we want to relativize this debate, we must look further back as well as just looking forward to 1918. Furthermore, I spoke, no thank you, of military rule within Ireland. The British Army is supposed to be loyal to the British Parliament. That is how it has always been. That is why the British Army has been so successful. It has never risen against the Parliament of Britain. In recent times, let's forget about Parliament. I'm not going that far. However, it is important to note that British officers were willing to mutiny against their own government, against those who had told them not to mutiny, who had told them to go back on service. They chose to mutiny in the interests of a minority up north. I'm not saying whether the minorities' interests were justified or not. They are justified. However, it does not give them a mandate to mutiny. There is as much oppression on their side as there is on ours. Then, onto the idea, no thank you, of exhausting alternatives. The Home Rule bills, 3 of them, had been attempted to have been passed in the past few decades before the Rising. The House of Lords bill had been brought in, that was some success. So yes, their side might say that we might get eventual Irish parliamentary control. However, this brings me on to the point of challenging the status quo and the other way. The men of 1916, and indeed the women, which disturbingly are forgotten about most of the time, it's not right, are outsiders. Bit of a non-sequitur, but anyway, they were outsiders within their own nation. They'd be here today, but not really in Trinity, but in the Gael School version of it then. You said they were a cabal of the IRB. They weren't. They were socialists, they were Republicans, they were nationalists, they were Catholics, they were Protestants, they were women, they were men. They're one of the most diverse groups to ever have a popular uprising since the French Revolution. No thank you, no thank you. That's saying something. Furthermore, they said that we can't accept the status quo in Ireland. That's something that makes them heroes, because it tells us that we shouldn't accept the situations we find ourselves in. Most of Ireland had become passively okay with the elite having everything and most people having nothing. The fact that our economy was being channeled out of Ireland to fuel a growing, expanding empire, that our young men and women were either being sent to factories or front lines to further the interests of an empire. The status quo at the time perpetuated kind of control of the Irish people, as all empires do. That's very applicable today. When our political system is in ruins, it's absolutely useless. Most political parties are very similar. You get very little difference between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Most of them work for the same agenda all the time. See the fact also that we have grinding poverty. We have an elite versus the rest mentality now. This is an important message to the Irish people. The message of 1916 is so inherently important and makes them heroes. I'll take you in a minute, because it tells us that this doesn't have to be the way. There is another way that we can go about achieving what we want to achieve. We don't have to live with the system we are born into. We can change it. That's incredibly important. It will always be relevant. It's one of those arguments that will carry through time and more. It is not a historical argument. It's an argument for all ages. It's very important in that regard. Before I go on with it, go on.
You say this debate is about oppression, but what do you say to the thousands of Magdalene women whose oppression was ignored and even perpetuated by some of 1916's leaders?
If the men and women of 1916 had not died, I say that if the proclamation had been enacted properly, they would not have been put into those laundries. I say that if we had listened to the proclamation effectively, rather than having our elites not change, because the elites didn't change after 1916. The elites have never changed. Redmond and his folks still are there, different form, still the same. The proclamation itself and the people within the rising were willing to change Ireland. We still haven't gotten many of the things that they say within the proclamation: socioeconomic rights, economic parity with each other, and more equality in general, religious and civil liberties. Those things aren't things that exist at the moment properly in Ireland. No, thank you, though. And with that in perspective, we must say that the men and women of 1916 were heroes because they enabled us to realize that everything doesn't have to be the same way it will always be. That the hegemony of the Catholic Church doesn't have to last as it did. No, thank you. That the control of the capitalist agenda through, like, say, banks and all of that doesn't have to last either. That social norms don't have to last. We see that in the marriage referendum. Things like that can change Ireland. Things like that are important. The men and women of 1916 inspired that. I'm repeating myself a lot because I've nothing else to say. I'm saying it more and more nicely. So that's okay. But that's very, very important, and thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, Ms. Bruce, for the speech, and invite Patty McGarry to continue on to the case of the proposition. Patty is the religious affairs correspondent with the Irish Times.
Chairman, it's almost simple. It was an impossible position for us. Thank you, sir. And we ignored the very central point of this whole debate: violence as a method of change. Nobody is saying that change wasn't required or wasn't necessary in Ireland. Whatever side of this debate we're on, I don't think anybody would say that was the case in the Ireland of 1916. We had the worst slums in Europe, there's no doubt about that. But we also had a method of change which was working for us up to then, and by agreement with the majority of the Irish people. We had an Irish party that for 40 years had been fighting for home rule, and in 1914 had succeeded at last, against all the odds, against the House of Lords, in having that home rule bill passed into law. It was the law of the land. The British government had no choice but to enact it in time, whatever about the position of officers down in the Curragh camp, who were sympathetic to the Unionist cause. The issue simply wasn't whether Ireland would be self-governing. That principle had been conceded. The issue was, what form would Irish self-government take? It was already becoming clear there would have to be two parliaments on this island, one in Belfast and one in Dublin. And that was what was about to take place. Sorry, I'm sorry. I have only so much time. And I mean, that again was agreed in principle prior to 1916, and that's what we had despite 1916. In fact, often many people would say because of 1916 and the methods that were employed in that year. The great problem with 1916, well, there are a number. I mean, Felix talked about the just war theology behind it. It doesn't exist where 1916 is concerned. It was on any level an immoral act. As well as that, it was utterly anti-democratic. It was even, I mean, you could say it was perpetuated by a minority within a minority, that minority being the Irish Volunteer Force, 92% of whom, at the behest of John Redmond and the Catholic Church, joined the British Army to fight for Catholic Belgium and the freedom of particularly Louvain, which had been overrun by the Germans in 1914, and where they executed about 400 people. Louvain, as you probably know from your history, had very close connections with Irish Catholicism, because that's where Catholic priests in Ireland were trained. It was one of the continental colleges where they were trained during the penal terms before Maynooth set up by the British, as was this institution, in Miller's case in the 1795. So it was basically the 8% that are left, that were left, that didn't go to war, were led by people like Paul McNeill, who himself disagreed with the decision made to arise in Easter 1916. That decision was made, I believe, on St. Stephen's Day 1915. And he called off, as you all know, the rising on Easter Sunday, creating huge confusion, meant that basically this minority within the minority then took it upon themselves to go ahead with the rising anyhow. But besides that, the leaders didn't tell many of the people who did come out what was going to happen. They led them blindly up to death. In fact, mostly women, mostly men. And by the way, women, the role of women in 1916, there's been some rewriting of all of this, mainly because of the series Rebellion, where you almost get the impression women had a central role in 1916. Women didn't have any significant role in 1916. They cleaned up, basically, and they cooked, and that was all. And they tended to the wounded from voluntary groups like St. John Ambulance, etc. They had a very minimal role, as was their position at the time in 1916, and to present 1916 as some sort of feminist revolt is pure and utter fiction. No, sit down. Now, help democracy. And free speech. Excellent. No, it was, but the greatest and shocking legacy of 1916, and there were a number of them. Number one, it was a Catholic uprising. And that is not to say anything about Catholicism per se. It was a sectarian event which led directly to the creation of two sectarian states on this small island of ours: a Protestant state for a Protestant people in Northern Ireland, a Catholic state for a Catholic people in the south of Ireland. And to underline the Catholic nature of the rising itself, every single one of the executed leaders died Catholic, including James Connolly, who received a priest twice before he died, including Roger Casey, who converted to Catholicism before he was hung in August of 1916, the last of the leaders to die. It was, and in many ways, even more, Pearse himself underlined the Catholic nature of the rising, if I can find it here, in a letter he wrote to his mother, home he wrote for his mother, shortly, the day before he died, in fact, in May of 1916. A mother speaks for his son, it reads, and you'll pick up on the comparison here immediately. Dear Mary, this is Mary, his mother's name is Margaret, she's writing, he is writing to Mary, the Mother of God. Dear Mary, that did see thy firstborn son go forth to die amid the scorn of men for whom he died, receive my firstborn son into thy arms, who also hath gone out to die for men, and keep him by thee till I come to him. Dear Mary, I have shared thy sorrow, and soon shall share thy joy. There's Pearse comparing himself to Jesus Christ, no less. He was going to be the redeemer of his people. He was shedding his blood for the Irish people. And he was quite clear theologically in what he was doing, because he'd written the previous December, again if I can find it in time, in an article in the Gale and Peace. It is good for the world that such things should be done. He's talking about the war. The old heart of the earth needed to be warmed with the red wine of the battlefields. Such august homage was never before offered to God as this, the homage of millions of lives given gladly for love of country. And by then it was already known that 100,000 men plus had died at Gallipoli, including 3,000 Irishmen. He saw that as a good thing. He saw blood sacrifice as a good thing. In my view, Patrick Pearse and his thinking and his outlook wasn't very far removed from IS today. They believed in blood sacrifice, in suicide to further their cause. And Patrick Pearse did much the same. He went out knowing he was facing certain death. I'm not so sure that was the case with all the men who led to their deaths, but certainly was the case with some of the leadership. And he did believe that they believed they were going to redeem the soul of the Irish nation by themselves dying. And of course, that's what happens. But the execution is what made heroes of them. They weren't heroes in themselves because they didn't behave in a heroic fashion. Their virtues were not heroic. They acted immorally, they acted antidemocratically without consulting anybody. They looked into their own souls to decide what was good for the Irish people, and therefore went out and led to the deaths, not just of themselves, but 485 people in this city, including 40 children under the age of 17, none of whom asked to die. 78 of whom were only remembered at the New Year's Day event this year, marking 1916, which is what prompted myself to write an article in the Irish Times. I think it's a disgrace. Everybody who died in 1916 should be remembered at these ceremonies this year. That would be the case later on at Easter. And that's also another factor. Theologically, it was time deliberately to coincide with Easter to underline what I said earlier on, this thinking of blood sacrifice, these men sacrificing their lives to resurrect the Irish nation. What it bequeathed to us, despite, as well as the two sectarian, inward-looking, bitter little states of this island with their prejudices, was it bequeathed a justification for violence. It bequeathed the right to the IRA to say, well, we're going out to do the same as Patrick Pearse and those men of 1916 did, and who were regarded as heroes afterwards by their followers, by the Irish nation indeed. None of you were around in 1966, but in 1966 there was an uncritical, almost adoration of these men and what they did, portrayed in a famous RTE series called Insurrection, written by, of all people, Hugh Leonard, who would have been quite critical of, later on in his life, of 1960. It justified the use of violence for political means in Ireland. It's the justification used today by the Continuity IRA, the Dissident IRA, as was used by the Provisional IRA, as was used by the Border Campaign in the 1950s, as was used by the IRA in the 1940s when the World War II, when it had to be interned, as was justified by John McBride and such people when he was Chief of Staff of the IRA in the 1930s. That is the legacy of these heroes to us today in this country. And in the context of the world we live in today, where violence of the nature we talked about with IS is justified for similar reasons, we cannot stand by these arguments justifying 1916. These people were not heroes. They were villains. It was bequeathed us because we gained nothing by their deaths except two stunted states. Thank you.
Our next guest speaker this evening, Liz Gillis, historian, author, and curatorial assistant in OTE.
Thanks for having me. I was going to talk about the personalities of the leaders and them as people and why I thought they were heroes, but just what we've heard tonight, I've just decided I'm going to talk about the women because I think they are being overlooked. Just to state that the Easter Rising coming on, it was not a feminist revolution, and the group that's been way overlooked and that was way ahead of its time is Nina Heron, set up in 1900 and really radical. Now, not in terms of republicanism, they wanted a republic, but these women actually wanted that republic to mean something, not just a change name, which is what it turned out to be. They were working amongst their communities. They were all about education, and they were working in the inner city communities of this city, as our colleague here mentioned. It was the worst slums in Europe. Now, the thing is, when you look at like small they were advocating the use of Irish materials, and they looked at the children of the inner city. What were the options open for them? The boys, it was going to the army, the girls went into service. Those kids were slipping through the cracks. And so they decided to set up classes, and they taught these kids, they gave them a chance. The thing is, those kids that they teach, they have a relationship with them. When the Féine Éireann was set up in 1909, you have a lot of those boys because they're actually learning about Irish history, what wasn't being taught in the schools. So they are being, I suppose, they're learning what their history is about. And the Féine is set up, and you have that relationship continuing. However, things begin to change in 1912 and so on. The Home Rule Bill is promised. Where were women in the Home Rule Bill? There was no room for women in the Home Rule Bill. Unina wasn't a feminist organisation. You would have some feminists in it, but their whole idea was to get a republic, and the republic was going to be different from the ground up, and the people who are going to benefit most from that were the next generation, the children. Of course, you have Coming Along being formed in 1914 April. You have the Ulster Volunteer Force being set up, you have the Irish Volunteer Force being set up, so there's lots of great change going on. Unina went so far. However, it's only a Dublin-based organisation. You have Coming Along, and that's a national organisation. Unina don't go away. Unina become a branch of Coming Along. At first, you had 4 branches in Dublin City. On the north side, you have the Fairview branch, the Central branch. You also have the Columkill branch, and then you have Unina, and they're operating on the south side. It's a huge organisation. But these women continue to be involved in their communities. In 1916, they did an awful lot more to make sandwiches, and the women were trained in how to use weapons, And what army doesn't actually eat? You need to feed, you need to eat to actually fight. This is essential work. Who is actually carrying dispatches from the GPO to Stephen's Green? It's the women. You have Leslie Price. She's actually chosen by Tom Clark to go to Malborough Street, the church there, to fetch the priest to get back to the GPO. She does this under fire. She's remonstrated by the priest. She says to him, I'll go back with you or without you. I've had confession. I've made peace with God. She does this, she gets him back, and she's promoted in the field. The women were doing an awful lot more than making sandwiches, but making sandwiches is just as important as carrying out dispatches. And then moving beyond with the Margone Lane garrison, the Nina branch. We have 22 women that are in Margone Lane. They surrender with the men, they share the same faith, they've been with them all week, they're not going to leave those men. And whatever happens to the men will happen to them. You have 77 women arrested, imprisoned, in Kilmainham jail. The women are released. You have also women deported. Countess Markovich, you have Countess Plunkett, you have, I think, at least 12 women are, Kathleen Lynn, another one, they're just exiled out of the country. And also what you do have is, we know that a lot of the Irish people didn't support the rebellion. The women showed the Irish people that these men were honourable men, they were people, they had flaws, they weren't superhuman, they weren't untouchable, they were like you, they were like me, they had their problems. But what they showed the Irish people, they went around collecting for the families of those who had died, the families of those who were in prison. And they showed the Irish people that they were ordinary men. And they actually gathered that support. So you know when you see the photographs of the rebels being marched out and they're being shipped off, you fast forward 6 months, they're coming home as heroes. And who does that are the women. You look what they do in the War of Independence. You've got women setting honey traps. They're going against the moral judgments. They're actually, women are, they're disowned by their families. They're putting themselves in great danger. They're going against everything that a woman should do, a good Catholic girl should do. And then to top it all off, the biggest losers when we do get our free state are the women. And the question that was being asked to me is, how could the women let themselves be treated like that? How could they go back and be so quiet? How could they go back into that little box? Well, how could the men let that happen? When they allowed them to set the honey traps, they allowed them to carry guns. You have the junior sisters taking snap machine guns. She has to actually, one of the sisters has to go make 3 journeys across the city. This is what the women were doing. The men so forgotten about it, the men allowed that to happen. So I was going to talk about something completely different. I ended up talking about the women, and from my perspective, when you look at what these women did do later on, when the revolution was over, it wasn't over for them. The fight for the Republic may have been over, however, the fight still went on in the communities. And although they weren't involved in big politics, that they're removed from that. Where they go, they know they can make a difference in the communities. So they get involved in the old age pension boards, you have them educating children, and you have them setting up Gorta and working with the Red Cross, and again, all these awards are doing so much great work. They're actually helping the people that need the most help. And they never lost that sight, because when they got involved, as I said at the start, the Republic is going to be something different, not just a change in name. The people that need to benefit most from this change of government were the ordinary people, the people that didn't have a voice. And you find with a lot of women, right up until the day that they die, that fight, that sense of social justice, it never ever leaves them. And some of them are still radical. They're still fighting for that Republic. We've got moral comfort. She's arrested when she's in her 80s, and she's, one of the last things she does when they go to clear her house, they have a pamphlet that she's typing up. But that sense of justice, of trying to make a difference, that stays with them. And what these women show me is that no matter where you're from, wherever, if you set your mind to something, if you believe in something, you can make a difference. No matter how small that difference is, even if it is just making a sandwich, that little sandwich, it does make a difference. So I think it's 7 left, so sorry. Thanks very much.
And next we have Senior Officer History and Politics student Courtney.
would struggle personally to say that the women of 1916 weren't heroes, and so I just don't think I'm going to say that. I am going to say that the men of 1916 weren't heroes for mainly one compelling reason, which I think is their treatment of the women at the time and going into the future. And I think that movement was based around them. They were in charge of that movement, and any problem with that movement can be laid at their feet, not at the feet of the women who were fighting, not just for their republic, but also for their human rights in the only way they knew how. So even if you believe that women are included in this motion, you must see that when we valorize 1916, at best, we remember Constance Markovich. At worst, we remember none of the women, and most, if not all, of the men. We think of it as a movement of men. We think of it as a movement that showed the great men of Ireland standing up for their rights and the women at the sidelines making sandwiches, even if that was not accurate, which it absolutely was not. So the women of 1916 were stalwart opponents of oppression and misogyny, but the men hounded them at every turn. The absolute hypocrisy of the men of 1916 is laughable. They wanted to be chivalrous in the sense that they wanted to protect women from the violence by not letting them fight. Yet at the same time, they sent them out into the fray to deliver messages, which was arguably a more dangerous place to put them because they wouldn't put guns in their hands. They were under just as much risk as men, arguably more risk in many cases, and yet they were not given the same credit. There was not one single signatory, the female signatory of the proclamation, that declared that men and women were equal. That is the what the hell? I wrote an essay on whether the 1916 constituted a feminist revolution when I was in second year, so I'd like to offer some choice quotes from that essay. Michael Staines would not allow a woman supervisor to send telegrams saying his men would see to it. Eamon de Valera shut the doors of Boland's Mills, leaving women literally knocking on the door outside, refusing to let them in. That's not safe at all, I guess. The Weekly Irish Times only mentioned the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizens Army, and Hibernian Rifles by name, never mentioned Cumann na mBan, or any other organisation of women. No complaint about that from the leaders of 1916. When Constance Markovich was mentioned, she was called a queen. She was also said to have a highly strong temperament and referred to as a wife before anything else. Her men were shocked at her behaviour because she smoked in front of them and wore trousers. Heroes, am I right? There is a mention of Whitmore's relief at seeing Cumann na mBan members coming over to his barricade one morning because now he could have a good breakfast. And when those women were in just as difficult, just as dangerous a position as the men, as I said, it is an absolute disgrace that this is the way they remembered. If we remember the men of 1916 as heroes, we have to change the way that we remember them in a way that includes these women. The way that the government now, the way that colleges now, the way that everyone now is remembering 1916 is not good enough. And in that context, I say we can't remember them as heroes. People say, oh, but Countess Markovich played an excellent role. The first thing I would say to that is that she wasn't a signatory, which if anything shows how little credit women were given for their contribution to the Rising, despite her bravery and the fact that some historians cite her as the last leader to surrender. Whether you believe that's true or not, it's at least in contention. And yes, the sexism of the 1916 Rising was a product of its time. But I think that a hero is someone who goes above and beyond being a product of their time. And at the point where your proclamation of a new nation declares women and men to be equal, the least you can do as a hero is to fulfill that in the most basic time of your rising. So that is another reason why I think they were not heroes. Going on to the more long-term reason why I wouldn't call them heroes. As I asked Dermot in a point of information, some of the leaders of the Rising actively contributed to the imprisonment of women in Magdalen laundries, actively placed in our constitution the idea that a woman's place was in the home. Yes, a lot of the men of 1916 did not support these values. Unfortunately, they were still used to hold up misogynist power in Ireland, and they were still used to justify those laws. So holding them up as heroes in that context only furthers that problem and only furthers the idea that women's place is in the home and that it was fine that our nation was proclaimed without any women on the document. Diarmuid says, oh, if the proclamation had been done properly, then it would have been fine and the Magdalen laundries would have all closed. Doubtful, given the Catholic nature of the Rising and the fundamentalist Catholic nature of the Rising, because obviously most Catholics don't hold up those values and do think that women deserve the same human rights as men. But also, alongside the proclamation was all the other nonsense, all the other documents that declared that Cumann na mBan were assistants to the Rising instead of a core part of it, and all of the other statements from leaders that women should assist the Rising and not be a good part of it. And the fact that Eamon de Valera, who didn't let women into Boland's Mills, who wrote into the Constitution that women should basically that women belong in the kitchen, was made leader of our country on the basis that he was a hero of 1916, that he stood up for our country, and that heroes deserve that place. They were used as a justification to put him in power, and that is an injustice that didn't get corrected. Liam, if you still want to give your point, I'll take it.
Fair enough. Just there, you were talking about women's involvement. Women were equal membership of the Irish Citizen Army, and that's why Countess Markovich served as second commandant in St. Stephen's Green. And I don't think it's fair to be able to say, you're a woman, therefore go sign that proclamation. Gender shouldn't give you a qualification to sign a document.
But I don't understand why you would think that Constance Markovich wouldn't be qualified to sign that document. She was a member of the Irish Citizens Army. But also, the Irish Citizens Army were like less than a tenth of the numbers of the Rising. There were 200 people in the Irish Citizens Army compared to masses in the rest of the organisations. So I don't think that that is enough to show like the place that women had. But I would also ask what it means to actually call these people heroes in the context of this Rising, right? Like their legacy is used to hold up oppressions today. Things like the Eighth Amendment, things like not sufficiently apologising for things like symphysiotomy and the Magdalen laundries. The idea that our nation was born in Catholicism and that like that's what our leaders of the Rising stood up for. But I also think that it seems harmful to me to declare that the men who died, who chose to die, were heroes more than the innocent victims of the British Army, the civilians caught in the crossfire, and even those women who were imprisoned by the state in places like Magdalen laundries, who had their children taken from them. If those people were as much victims as the men of 1916, then I think they were as much heroes too, because they stood up against oppression and they stood up for their rights. And if you call one Irish person a hero for standing up for their rights, then you should call them all heroes as well. That would be a better justification, and we should do that instead. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dee for her fine speech and invite Ian Kelly, Junior Sophomore History and Politics students, to continue on the case in the opposition.
Cordia, so I think we've just heard the kitchen sink of all the faults of the Irish state for the 20th century being thrown at 16 dead men from 1916. I think we've gone overboard with that. Just in relation to some points that have been made by the proposition, this idea that the leaders, by their actions, went against the will of the Irish people in 1916. The vast majority of whom had no right to vote in 1916. Therefore, their representatives in Parliament did not represent the Irish people. They were not the representatives, if you like, of the majority of the Irish people. 600 to 700,000 men in this country had the right to vote at that time in history. Not a single woman, which the proclamation did do, at least try to do its best at resolving, when it said that we would have universal suffrage in this country before most countries in the world at that stage even considered that proposal. We do have the opening line, of course, of the proclamation, Irish men and Irish women, and it's very firmly there on an egalitarian basis. On the issue of sectarianism, it's just not there. We have this appeal of cherishing all of the children of the nation equally. That's an outreach to unionists or to people from the Protestant community, particularly in the north of Ireland. It's saying you have nothing to fear in such a republic as the republic we are trying to create. If you take the Irish Volunteers, look at their creation, they say they strive to achieve all the common liberties of all of the people of Ireland. It goes out of its way to try and say to the unionist community, look, we want you to have civil and religious liberties enshrined in the proclamation. Therefore, we're not talking about some sort of Catholic superstate, although we might be able to say the same for John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party. And on that, Redmond and the whole First World War have been largely left aside from this debate. And that's something that really does need to be looked at. We talk about death toll, we talk about 40 children being killed during 1916. 10 million people died during World War I in this slaughter on behalf of empires to try and expand their borders, to gain more commercial opportunities, and to take colonies across the world. And it was a battle between different empires. But what did John Redmond do? Claiming to do it on behalf of the Irish people, he threw us into a war against people with whom we have no quarrel, against people in Turkey, against people in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and so on. And it was not right for that to happen. Irish freedom is above being besmirched by the likes of Redmond, who go to the table looking for crumbs from the empire. How many Irish lads do you want there? Asquith, how many? Do you want 200,000? There's 200,000. Thanks for the Parliament in Dublin, which doesn't even have control over lighthouses, canals, or post offices. And that was the situation we were dealing with. I'll take yourself.
Then why did 200,000 people actually obey the Redmond's call to volunteer as opposed to the less than 1,000?
Okay, well, let's look at how World War I was portrayed to the Irish people. Little Catholic Belgium gets attacked, the Germans are savages, go in and save little Catholic Belgium. If there's any group who has to be blamed for using religion as a motive to try and incite people, it's the constitutional nationalists. Further to that, why do people go join the British Army? Join the British Army like for any other reason they join an army. For economic gain, to put food on the table for their families, because they've been blacklisted as a result of taking part in the Dublin lockout and therefore can't get work from the employers who in large part do support John Redmond, and they keep him afloat politically as well. And that is why people went off to fight and give their lives in World War I for an absolute waste. The thing is as well, what we're coming back to is this idea that things weren't really that bad in Ireland, wasn't really an occupation by a foreign power. Year 1800, let's look at democracy. In the year 1800, actually the year 1799, British government decides, look, we need to get rid of the Irish Parliament. What do we do? Let's try and bribe them to vote themselves out of existence. And they try to do that, and if they reject that into Parliament in 1799, they come back the next year, the British government throw a couple of bit more money at these fellas in Parliament, and then they go and decide, sure, we're going to vote ourselves out of existence this time. We lose our Parliament. Britain takes that Parliament, 105 MPs in the British Parliament representing Ireland out of a total of 600. How is that democracy for the Irish people? And even at that stage, even when we do go down the constitutional route, what happens? O'Connell gets there, and fair play to O'Connell for the work that he did do, for the campaigning that he did. But it was a dead end because he was only up to about 40 members of Parliament. He can't have a majority in a 600 member of Parliament building. Basically, O'Connell is not able to go there. Similarly with Parnell, they cannot get a majority necessary to get what the Irish people want. But what the Irish people want is varying degrees of independence. Yes, that's a given. Issues over what we exactly want. But the matter is that the British government never had any right to rule this country. And as a result of that, no right is necessary for the Irish people to rise up against it and to bring back control to their own country yourself.
So the men in 1916 summarily executed unarmed bureaucrats without trial. Are those heroic actions?
Unarmed bureaucrats without trial, you're going to have to fill me in and let you come back in just to name someone. No one. Okay. So I'll actually just continue on this point. Court-martials. Records from the court-martials show that British soldiers were taken captive by the rebels when they're put on trial in court-martials. These soldiers will actually come in and testify in favour of the leaders of 1916, saying they were treated most humanely and with great dignity by the people who held them, by the volunteers. We move on as well. This comparison with the Islamic State. Pierce surrendered to prevent the further slaughter of Dublin citizens and to save the lives
after the killing of 500 people.
Save the lives of his followers. People die in conflict. The British Army accept the fact when they go into conflict, they are going to kill people. Why should the British Army and any other imperial army have an exclusive right to be able to go into conflict? Surely an attempt for national liberation, which has been clearly sought by the Irish people, but suppressed time and time again, surely they are justified to use some degree of force. The British government only ever used the argument of force. The Irish people tried to use the force of argument and they weren't successful, so they had to turn to the arguments of force themselves. 1918, what did the British government decide to do? Not recognise the democratic elected Parliament of Ireland, Dáil Éireann. They declared it illegal. They tried to shut down this country's republic, and we ended up with a free state and a 6-county state in the north, which drove both sections of this country further and further away from each other, and it's passed. I beg you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Ireland was overrepresented by reference to its population in the rest of the country.
I'd like to thank Liam for his fine speech and just remind all speakers as well as the audience that should you wish to interject, your point of information must be accepted first. And now, closing up the case for the proposition, we have Liam Kennedy, Professor Emeritus of Economic and Social History at Queen's University, Belfast.
Irish men and Irish women, in the name of God and of the dead generations. It's the opening line of the 1916 proclamation, and that's the manifesto of the leaders of the rising. So it's well worth looking at that manifesto carefully. Poor old God, he's already signed up on the side of the Ulster Unionists during the signing of the Ulster Covenant in 1912, and now Irish Republicans are lining him up on their side. So it's confusing times in the heavens, as between orange and green, but as Bob Dylan sang many years ago, when it comes to war, we've all got God on our side. Dead generations. The great thing about the dead generations is that they always vote the right way. This morning's Irish Times, Patsy will tell you, tells us that in the forthcoming general election, Fine Gael are likely to get 28% of the vote, Fianna Fáil 21%, Independents are massive, 25%, and so on. Perhaps we should dispense with opinion polls and elections. Let's check the graveyards of Ireland to see what the people really want. One corpse, one vote might be the new mantra in deference to 1916. Out with decadent ideas like democracy and voting rights. It continues, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag. Ireland? Who's she? Like the dead, Ireland can be whatever you want her to be. But of one thing you can be sure, the leaders of the 1916 Rising did not mean the people or the peoples of Ireland. North and West. Problem is, we can't trust them.
I think it's streamed on YouTube as well.
Pierce wrote Misha Era, some of you read it in. 2 lines in it, Mormon or McClown fame the Yellow Walk. My great shame, my own children who sold me. Mother Ireland was a projection of the romantic fantasies of Pierce, Connolly, Joseph Mary Plunkett. And feminized, of course, for emotional and manipulative effect. In addition, we the people were merely children in the proclamation, an infantilizing image that may be a subconscious expression of Pierce's own, hopefully latent, paedophilia. Supported by gallant allies in Europe, we heard about them a moment ago, Ireland strikes in full confidence of victory. The latter is clearly a lie. James Connolly said on Easter Monday, just before going out, we're going out to be slaughtered. Pierce, in any case, was already half in love with death. dying to kill, and indeed he succeeded in both objectives. Innocent Dubliners, as we've heard, would bear the brunt of the casualties, but then they were mere extras in the heroic drama that Pearse was enacting. The gallant allies, not long before this, remember, and you've seen the picture, Liberty Hall had proudly worn the banner, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser." And now, Easter week, post-Easter week really, 1916, Connolly and the Irish Citizen Army were collaborating with a foreign power already notorious for barbarities in Belgium. Of course, this was used in British propaganda. The trouble was there was little need to exaggerate because there were horrific German atrocities, not to mention the slaughter which was going on in the Balkans. Here's a thought. Had the German army invaded Ireland in 1916, as the men of 1916 clearly wanted to be the case, what would have been the consequences for the real people of Ireland? I can tell you it wouldn't have been a handful of executions. To look at the proclamation again, in every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times in the past 300 years, they have asserted it in arms. Now, it's a nice touch of bombast, but it's historically illiterate. There hadn't been rebellions in every generation. There wasn't an Irish nation in, say, 17th, 18th centuries. Nationalism is a modern invention. And indeed, Pearse was contemptuous of the Irish people of his father's generation for not producing a rebellion. And by the way, those 6 rebellions, this rosary beads of rebellions seems to include 1641, when ethnic slaughter was the order of the day. So that's a hardly reassuring precedent for the kind of republic which would eventually be revealed. We now come to a phrase in the proclamation which I think is one of the most presumptuous and sinister of all. The Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irishman and every Irishwoman. So without so much as by your leave, 7 conspirators, a secret 7 if you like, meeting in the back room of Tom Clark's tobacco shop, decided to conscript the people of Ireland into an Irish Republic, nationalists and unionists. Yes?
Just on the issue then of conscription, they didn't wish to conscript anyone to anything. They did as an ordinary state would do, and that is seek the allegiance of their own citizens.
They should have asked the people first whether they wanted this particular state. They simply presumptuously say, you are all in this Irish Republic that we have defined in our terms with reference to a provisional government that nobody even knew about. Ironically, the heirs of 1916 would be in the forefront of the campaign against conscription 2 years later. So to put it in a nutshell, 100 years ago, a tiny group of men crouched in the cockpit of the GPO and were ecstatic at the prospect of striking a blow against Britain. Almost a century later, we pick up some echoes from earlier contributions, almost a century later, on the other side of the Atlantic, in another moment of ecstasy, a group of Islamist militants crashed their bodies and machines into the twin towers that dominate the Manhattan skyline in New York. The parallels in terms of sacrifice, death, martyrdom, and reception into heaven, shouldn't leave that out, are uncomfortable. The GPO casts a long shadow across 20th and 21st century Irish history, yes?
There is one major difference between that and the 1960 Rising. When they started the 1960 Rising, they fought in the same way that any regular army would, do uniforms against positions, they didn't advocate terrorist actions by bombings or the like.
Tom Clark, perhaps the architect of the Rising, in fact, had a good terrorist background behind him. One of the leaders of the dynamiting campaign in England and Scotland, actually, in the 1880s. There are differences, of course, all parallels and quite so neat. In terms of the leadership, though, much of the thinking, that ecstasy of violence, martyrdom, parallels are very close. The GPO casts a long shadow across, say, 20th and 21st century Irish history. And towards the end of that shadow, to personify it rather, stands the figure of Thomas Slab Murphy, warlord, fraudster, and a good Republican. If we want to have heroes, then let us celebrate the tenement dwellers of inner city Dublin, the immediate victims of the Rising. Their 6-day and lifelong struggles against poverty, unemployment, and appalling housing conditions, typically with Catholic slum landlords, borders on the heroic. Let us recall also the warning of the great German playwright Bertolt Brecht, "Unhappy the land that is in need of heroes." So my final words, stand by the people, the real people of Ireland. Look back on the Great War with anger, certainly. Look back on Easter 1916 with anger. To use the punk generation's phrase, no more heroes anymore. Thank you.
Speech, and now closing up the case for the opposition, we have senior freshman history and political science student, that's our third Isabel student of the evening, Chris Koski.
In that long winter in 1847, some of them died crying. Some of them died alone. Some of them had lost so much and suffered so dearly, they didn't care that death was coming. They wanted its sweet embrace. They were so hungry that when they moved, everything they did was defined by pain. Entire families, entire communities, entire towns wiped out. 1,000 people, 1 million people starved to death. Another million forced to go. And where did this happen? In the center of world power, in the greatest, richest empire the world had ever known, and they left 1 million of their own self-described citizens to die. There could be no constitutional means anymore. There could be no working with them to leave the system. We had to be done with them. We couldn't let it happen again. We needed our own way. We needed our own path. This is the context we have this debate over. This is not a group of lads who went into like a post office and a biscuit factory and decided that they wanted to take it back so they could make some kind of great show for themselves. They knew that the people of Ireland fundamentally needed to form their own roots and to go in their own place. Because when that happened, when those people died, the British media, the British bureaucrats, they vilified them. People who were involved in the governance of this country at the time are quoted as saying that perhaps it was sent by God to do something about the Irish problem. There are extreme racial undertones to what was occurring. They saw us as inferior. We couldn't trust the UK to create a political settlement in which we could be included in. We couldn't trust them to create a law by which we could earn our freedom. We had to go our own way. We see that historically through the penal laws, through the economic system that was built to specifically oppress us, through the destruction of our native language, our native communities, our native systems, our native ways of being, the culture that defined us as being different from other nations in the world. You see, they talk to us a lot and rest everything on this grand notion of democracy. First of all, I say very simply, if someone comes up to you in the street and hits you in the face again and again and again, do you need a democratic mandate to get them to stop, or can you hit them back? What they were doing to us was that cruel, and that necessitated us being able to fight. But let's take them at their best. Let's say we should have gone the democratic route and that there was no electoral mandate. First of all, what kind of elections were these? In the first of all, half the population wasn't franchised, and that women got no say in these elections. Moreover, we look at the fact that the IPP was traditionally dominant throughout that period for so long that it was impossible for other parties to get a foothold. And finally, let's point to the fact that 1916 had been 6 years after the 1910 elections. Great deals had changed in Irish society, where many more people were due to be franchised. But moreover, we say when 1918 came around, we see this as being that retroactive legitimization of it. And they say Sinn Féin had nothing to do with the rising, right? They were definitely separate. First of all, note that most people didn't think that anyway at the point at which the media called it the Sinn Féin rising. But moreover, look at the fact that in the election material for Sinn Féin candidates, they talked about the 1960 rising. Look at the obvious fact that many of the candidates involved were often being interned in the UK because they were involved in the 1916 rising, or were specifically clearly stating it. This was a clear occurrence, right? But let's talk about violence and let's talk about Home Rule. Because Home Rule failed, it failed again and again and again. We have spent 60 years on it and the British government were unwilling to adhere to it. They postponed it consistently. And this is an important thing to know because they talk to you about violence. Who was it who brought the gun into Irish politics? When the UVF brought arms into this country to effectively undermine the Home Rule bill that was going to occur, the British turned a blind eye and allowed them to come in. They allowed them to run weapons in this country. During the Curragh Mutiny, it was specifically clear that the UK Parliament could not control its own forces in Ireland. At this circumstances, the Irish people are effectively in anarchy. At this point, their legitimate government has basically said, we cannot protect you anymore. At this point, why would you bother with that system if it's literally going to result in your democratic wishes causing death upon you, right? And you know what the best thing is? When they tell you violence is terrible, right? And they also tell you Home Rule is fantastic. Then why is it okay that Redmond sent 270,000 Irish people? Why is it alright that Redmond sent 27,000 Irish men, no thank you, to die in the fields of France so it would be more likely that Home Rule would be achieved? No thank you. Why was it alright for the Home Rulers to send those people off to be slaughtered and that violence is legitimate for that imperialist cause? But when we do it in Ireland, it isn't. To quote a good song, is it not better to die under an Irish sky than it is at Cedar Bar? No, thank you. But Dee does bring us a very legitimate point regarding how the women were treated during 1916 wasn't acceptable, and unfortunately, the leaders of 1916 were very much a product of their time and held terrible misogynistic attitudes. But what we say here is that when we don't celebrate the men and women of 1916, we have a serious problem in those women ever being able to be discussed, in their legacies ever being able to be engaged with on a historical basis. No, thank you. Meaning that we can never be able to, that they have to suffer twice over. Not only in the context of the fact that they were treated badly by male superiors, but often at times now, historically, we don't understand the immense, as we've heard so saliently, the immense sacrifices that those women made. And when we celebrate them, we get to celebrate those women, celebrate what they did for Ireland. But moreover, we look and see that there is an alternative to misogyny that exists in our society, and upon which we can try and have a society that is as inclusive of both men and women as possible. The alternative, D, is that we effectively have to label those women as terrorists. We have to completely erase them from our history in that meaningful way. And that is something that just isn't legitimate. Ladies and gentlemen, actually, I'm looking to you.
If you propose the link between Sinn Féin, for example, bringing in suffrage and the 1916 rising, will you similarly admit the link between the heroism, or the supposed heroism of the leaders, and things like the Magdalen laundries and women's place being in the kitchen and some physiognomy?
Yeah, I would accept that the Irish Free State and precursively the Republic of Ireland recognise the 1916 rising in a manner to which to do terrible things, right? I accept that it's still going on today and that many people take that legacy. But the problem is, right, is that consistently throughout history, we see people taking things like that and doing it as it is. What I think we need to remember is that the heroic act of what the men of 1916 did in trying to set Ireland on a course in which it could be able to make a fairer society is one that must fundamentally be remembered. So why must we call them heroes? Why must we honour them? Because heroic actions do justify the title of heroes. And why is that so important today? Because it allows us to hold the elites that we have today, who oftentimes consistently fail us, to a higher ideal. To say that there are people who once upon a time saw that the system was not good enough and that they died for it. Why can't you do better? Why can't you make the system fair? There's a question that's often thrown about. What did the men of 1916 do? I'm not going to be claimed to completely be able to answer that question, but I will give it a bit of it. I'd say that the men of 1916 died to allow us to, as Irish men and Irish women, determine what combat it was that they died for. To not have that narrative thrown upon us by a stronger British government, to not be able to protect us, and to be able to ensure that the horrors of 1847, when we were left to die and our government did nothing, would never occur again. I couldn't physically possibly be happier to oppose.
Indeed, thank all the speakers for what was a wonderful debate tonight. So one more round of applause for everybody. So what we're going to do now is have a vote on the motion. So I'm going to ask you whether you're in favour or against. Starting with in favour, in which case you say aye, and against, in which case you say nay. So all those in favour? Aye. All those against? Nay. Okay, I'm going to go with a show of hands, because that was like unclear to me. So all those in favour, hands up. Okay, we can start with that.
We vote for you.
Yeah, definitely do, because this looks like this is a close one.
It's not that close.
16 and 27. Does anyone want to add those up?
43.
Thanks. All those against. Okay, I think it is against. Yeah.
You want to speak as well?
All right, so by a very close margin, the nays have it, so the motion falls. A few announcements before we go to reception. First of all, next week's debate is going to be the Student Economic Review. We have a debate, it's Trinity versus Harvard, and so same time, same place. And the week after that is going to be the exact debate, which is fully organised by freshers. If there's any freshers in the room who aren't involved yet and who would like to be involved, definitely check out the Field Freshers page if you're in it. And if not, Manis, who's going to stand up now, is your man. We're talking to any one of us about it. And furthermore, we also have on the 15th of February for freshers our annual blood drive, and followed by defensively, yes, we take your blood.
A modern form of blood sacrifice.
It's just good evening of kind of defending indefensible motions and having cans. And furthermore to that, there's the sign up for Galway IV up on Facebook as well as the notice board. If you'd like to come, that's happening in 2 weekends' time. And then in terms of tonight, we'd like to first of all invite you next door, which is going to be themed as the birthday of Countess Markovich, which is apparently today. And secondly, after that, we'll be going at 10 p.m. to the Celt on Talbot Street, music by Derek Warfield, followed by DJing by Connor Scully, with all the original Cranberries chorus and good old Irish music. And yeah, that's for Yo-Yo In, and hopefully we'll see you there. And I'd like you all to check as well, final notice, your oratory returns, and hand them to Izzy and Tom, who are at the door. Thank you very much.